the materials that I have, if you're interested in them, what I've got put together from this project is listed on the website at the bottom of the slide. And as far as I know, I'm the only Koontz at Colorado State. So if you look up me there, you'll get one email, and it's pretty easy to get in touch with me. So what am I going to do? I'm going to talk about what's going on in fed cattle markets, in particular the cash trade. Talk about that potential problem. Talk about the research results. Some of the project is mostly done, and it's really sitting at the stage where national associations and state associations need to take a look at some recommendations and decide what they want to do. So the impetus is at this stage back on some of the cattlemen's organizations. All right, so let's take a look at trade in cash markets. This is information from mandatory price reporting, and there's plenty of room down front. Sitting there in the back squinting away. Now I know where your children get this behavior from. I teach class, and I come in and I got to run them up to the front. I got 2 or 3 girls that sit up front. That's about it. All right, so the blue line is negotiated trade. The dotted line is a negotiated grid. The red line is formula cattle, and the green line is forward contracts. And clearly, you have sort of an even split, not a little less than 50-50, back to 2011. And since then, the market has migrated towards more formula transactions and at the expense of negotiated cash trade. There's simply less negotiated cash trade going on. So what are we talking about here? Negotiated is the cash market. That is a market where there's bid and ask. It doesn't matter what the units are. Okay, it can be live, carcass, grid, you name it. But there's bid and ask that goes on. What that means is there's price discovery. There's work to discover price. Formula trades are, by definition, transactions where the price is discovered elsewhere. And it could be anywhere. It could be futures. It could be an average, a regional weighted average price. It could be the 5 market weighted average. It's some combination of those things. It could be futures. It could be retail. It could be wholesale in the box. It's simply a formula transaction off of some other reported price. The predominant means of trading in that formula category is using some other USDA AMS reported price. Okay, so that's largely what's going on there. Forward contracts, there's price discovery with forward contracts, but those are transactions with more than 14 days out, so the cattle will not be scheduled for delivery. They're not going to be delivered within that 2-week window. Your cash market is basically this week for this week and this week for next week. That is your cash market. So beyond next week is a forward contract. Packer owned, you'll see some information on that, and what that means is not partial ownership. That is 100% packer owned. Now I'm going to refer to these things as AMAs. They are alternatives to the cash market. They are alternative marketing arrangements. And a long time ago, they picked up the label of captive supplies. That's what we think of them as, but let's refer to them as some alternative to the cash market, much less loaded terminology. All right, let's drill into the different regions. So this is Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico. What you see is it is 90%, close to 90% formula trades. That blue line has disappeared down into the bottom. It is less than, some weeks there's no cash trade. Okay, so very minimal negotiated grid, very minimal forward contracts, and negotiated cash is hiding down there with it, very minimal. Okay, it's the balance of that north of 90% that you see. Okay, so you have Texas largely going to a formula arrangement. Let's move north, Kansas. Kansas has had periods where negotiated is larger, but here recently we have more periods where the formula transactions have picked up. And notice you see much bigger swings in forward contracts with respect to Kansas. You see more forward contracting done in certain periods in Kansas. Move up to Nebraska. Nebraska is your market with the most depth. That is the market where most price discovery is taking place. That is where we're negotiating cash trades, a fairly constant amount of forward contracting, and relatively less formula trades. So that's what's going on in cattle markets in general, in your regional markets, and let's contrast that with hogs. Okay, so that big, the red line at the top, that is your swine or pork market formula-based transactions. Hogs are largely traded on formula. And that negotiated purchase, that dark blue line, has slid off to be down around 2%. There are weeks where it's below 2%. It's 1.7, 1.8, something like that. So the hog market has, cattle are in essence doing something very similar to what hogs have done, which is get rid of discovering a cash price and use some other mechanism to value animals. Let's back up a little bit. This is the first data I showed you was weekly, and I don't want to crowd it up too much. So let's back up and do monthly, and let's do monthly since we started mandatory price reporting. Okay, this is where we used to not get any information on formula and forward contract trades. After NPR, we were convinced we were going to discover something new. What we really discovered when you looked at the formula prices is formula prices were the prior week's cash prices. That's largely the way we formula trade cattle. Okay, but if we go all the way back to when NPR started, again, a bit of a tug of war where negotiated started out pretty strong, and then very gradually over time, negotiated is being displaced by formula arrangements. That's what's going on. Not a whole lot of increased use in forward contracts, some variation in forward contracts, and they're important in some regional markets, but not as big as you might think. All right, what are the incentives to be on the formula? I've done some interviews with large formula operations, ask them, why do you do what you do? What's going on here? It is largely it's largely the result of a cost-cutting exercise. It is largely the result of a cost-cutting exercise. Better cattle management. I know when the cattle are going to be gone. I know when I bought them. I know when I'm feeding them. I know when they're going to hit target weights, and I know when I want them to be gone. They will be gone that week. It's not up to the negotiated process that might fail that week to determine when the cattle go. Okay, so cattle management, feedlot management. If you look at formula operations, they have fewer personnel, they have fewer mills, they have fewer feeding systems. They are cheaper. Capacity utilization in formula yards is substantially higher. Substantially higher. Formula yards have basically used their yard at almost full capacity. And I've interviewed a couple that have used their yards in excess of full capacity. I asked them where in the parking lot they were feeding cattle, but they're using their facilities at close to 100% capacity. And on average, it's 90-something, 92, 93. Lucky to get it up to 96. If you compare that to what's going on with the cash yards, they typically use capacity at 78, 77, 78, and a high of something like 82 to 83%. So the formula yards use their fixed cost. They spread out their fixed costs more. Okay, they're able to allocate out those feed mills and systems and personnel over more animals. Okay, so cheaper. Last, one of the most expensive people in the feed yard is not on the phone with the packer. That person is usually with a database trying to figure out what cattle made money and why, and how do I go get some more next year. Okay, that person is not on the phone dickering with packers. They're looking at their databases and figuring out where to buy cattle. And they take that cost savings that they have and they go give some of it to, if it saves them $3, they typically give one of it away because they want those feeder cattle again. If you don't know how, if you're a cow-calf producer and you don't know how your calves perform in a feed yard, I guarantee you there's a feeder that does. They have a database that does that. Now, they may not know your yard exactly, but they know the order buyer, they know the sale barn, they know a lot about where those animals come from. And they know what makes money, and they go back and get it. When you talk to packers about why they're involved in formulas, first of all, the formulas largely are driven by the cattle industry. The cattle industry is what has pushed these things. Packers will do it, but they're not the ones that are actively attempting to make the thing change it or do it. It was largely driven by the feeding industry. Okay? But when you go into the packing side, they have benefited as well. They've chased out some costs. They have higher volumes, more predictable volumes, and lower costs, period. They have fewer personnel. They've been able to not replace cattle buyers. How many of you have as many cattle buyers as you had 12 years ago, 10 years ago? How many of you have fewer cattle buyers that come to your yard? Okay, that saves them, if you ask a packer, losing a buyer saves them $100,000. That's not cheap. Okay, now they do need to get the cattle bought, but they're doing it with fewer people and more electronic means as well. Okay. Last, one of the big drivers of formula participation is chasing program cattle. If you've got a packer that has a variety of meat programs that they need specific types of animals to hit, they sure don't risk having to go out this week and get them bought. They've got them lined up as soon as possible. Okay, so the incentives to be on the formula, from what I can tell, are in excess of average cattle feeding profits. So doing this will make me more money than feeding cattle. Okay, that's a pretty important driver. What do we know about AMA research in general? And I'm absolutely certain of this. I've done most of it. AMAs are not used to manipulate the cash market price. Okay, you simply cannot find that in the data. You can find volatility. For example, 2014, I guarantee you folks, because you have so many formula cattle in 2014, your cash prices were higher than they would have been had you not had those formula cattle. Likewise, you go back to 2013, those prices were lower than they should have been because you had so many formula cattle. Okay, it works both ways. When there's plenty of cattle on show lists, then prices are relatively soft, and when demand is good and packers are hungry, making good margins, prices are strong. It goes both ways. It's not one way or the other. AMAs appear to be linked to improving your product. Think back to the product you had in the 80s and the 90s. It's much better now than it was. And a lot of that is due to production systems. And a lot of the marketing out of those production systems is due to formulas, construction of formulas. AMAs are cost reducing, packers are more efficient, and feed yards are more efficient. If you look high and wide, you simply don't find what we thought we were going to find with NPR, which was sweet deals. And you certainly don't see the coercion. This is largely driven by the cattle feeding side. Okay, my summary of some research that was done back in, it was put out in 2007. It was finished up in 2005 and 6, and we used the baseline of dollars to consider inflation was 2003. AMAs basically net your industry very close to $10 billion. And that is about 14% of one of the ways economists measure economic wealth, the construction of economic wealth in production systems. per year in 2003 dollars. 10 billion per year. Okay? All right, so let's talk about markets a little bit more. Some ideas on markets. Markets will become too expensive. Markets that are too expensive will not be used and will be replaced with something. Okay, let's see if you know your history here. Anybody for the bottom left? Where's bottom left? It's the south side of Chicago. How about the top? That's Omaha. Okay, and my wife's from Omaha. I spent some time trying to figure out where in the hell this picture was taken. That building right there, you can buy a condo in now, and it's the only one left. Rest of it is a community college, largely a parking lot. And bottom right, been to the stock show? That building's still there. It just has I-70 running right through the middle of it. Okay, that's Denver, bottom right-hand side. Okay, markets that get too expensive to use will not be used. They'll be replaced with something. Okay, so what's next? What I think is next is that negotiated cash market. It has become too expensive to use for lots of organizations. They have a different business model. They have a different way of valuing cattle and doing business and making money. Okay, but the livestock industry would like price information. We need it to use as basis for our formulas. We need it to use as to link up with our risk management programs. You still need to know basis to do your hedging. You need to do some benchmarking. Is what I'm doing making money or not, and how much money can I save by doing something different? So the industry wants price information, but it would sure like to not have to participate in those markets. We would like the information, but I'd sure like the option to not go there. Okay? So I do think negotiated cash trade is next. The incentives are to move away from negotiated cash trade. And there's no magic further up in the marketing system. There's no magic up in beef prices, because I can guarantee you the same thing's going on in beef sales. Okay, all that product enhancement and value added, the people on both sides of that trade, they don't want to value the base. What they want to do is they want to value the increment. Okay, and so I interviewed a restaurant company that purchased natural pork for their plates, for what they were selling. And they didn't want to have to trade with a pork processor to buy shoulders. But they knew what that natural was worth. So they were on a formula to pay what everybody else was paying for pork shoulders, and then they would negotiate the premium associated with that natural dimension. So they want to negotiate the increment, but they don't want to deal with the base. They want to pay what everybody else pays. And if you look at formulas, that's what motivates it. I want to get paid a market price. I don't care what that market price is. I'm competing on other means. Cost side, value side, whatever. Okay, I'd like to chase out some of the inefficiencies in how I do business. And so there's no magic downstream on the beef prices, and then likewise, this is going to create problems in your live cattle futures market, because you do need some mechanism to tie futures to cash. I mean, that simply has to happen. I come from hard red winter wheat country, KC. You think you have basis problems, you need to go look at hard red winter wheat. We've had a disaster with basis problems. Okay, so basis is awful important to any type of risk management program, and making futures markets work, do what we want. All right, so let's transition a little bit. How do we solve this problem? And I'm going to do it through some examples. Suppose we have a group of cow-calf producers that don't have enough of their own land to graze all their animals, but they have access to common property. Okay, what will happen to that common property? It'll be overused. It'll be overgrazed. The same thing happens to all common property. We wind up overusing it. Fisheries are a great example. The way to keep from overusing fisheries is to license fishing. How much? Have quotas. Have the fishermen own the fish. If they don't own the fish, they overfish. Okay, it's the same deal with grazing. If you don't own the grass, if it's not up to you to have the stewardship, you tend to overuse what you have access to. Public goods are overused because the individual doesn't pay their full cost. There's no market solution to this problem. It is a situation where the market is broke. It is a market failure. The solution requires collective action. You have to get together and say, what are we going to do? You have to agree. Now, collective action, lots of times, is done through government. That's why one of the reasons why we have government. But for some reason, I know quite a few people that aren't too hot on democracy. I'm not sure why. I kind of like it when I read the paper. I sure like ours better than lots of other ones. Okay? But you don't have to do it through government. You can do it with an association. You have a small enough industry that I think you can get them in the room and you can figure out who's going to do what. And if somebody doesn't come through on you, for you, you'll know. I mean, it's not that big. It's not like the entire consuming public. It's just the cattle industry. Got a question for you. How many of you read this? Keep your hands up, because I'm going to send Mr. Meyer your picture, because he's right up the road in Anarchy. No, he's in 8. That's correct. Correct. Keep your hands up. How many of you read this? Next question. Leave them up. How many of you pay for it? That's why I took the first picture. And this is the issue. Boy, Dr. Koontz, that's an old issue. That's correct. This is the one where he's asking for money. This newsletter takes resources that Steve Meyer and Len Steiner burn up every week to put you out a newsletter to read. And how many of you pay for it? I want it one more time. How many of you pay for it? Excellent. That is how you keep Steve Meyer providing this newsletter. If you don't pay for it, he has a very strong incentive to go do something else with his time that pays. Now that he's developed knowledge out there that he does this type of thing, I'm sure he has plenty of business. If you don't pay for this, it will go away. Okay? It's the exact same thing with your cash market. Cash market participants invest resources to negotiate and discover cash market prices. Formula operations save all that money and make use of prices discovered elsewhere. This is exactly the tragedy of the commons. Okay, can you imagine how well this discussion went over in Texas? You know how you can tell a Texan's mad? They don't say anything. As long as they're talking, everything's okay. As soon as they zip it up, and then they go into stance or reaching for guns, you got trouble. Okay, but the other thing I have is I'm right. Okay, this is exactly the tragedy of the commons. We need some way the market solution is to do something about this. You have to invest resources because the economic incentives are very clear. Formulas are cheap. They enable you to capture value by doing the right things with cattle, cut costs, and then capture value through grids. Market the right cattle to the right place. Okay? But it's not that easy. We do have some things we need to know. We don't know how small markets can get and still function well. We don't know that. And again, there's not a solution. If you wait, this will not solve itself. And my evidence is hogs, dairy, fruits, and vegetables. Every other industry is very, very thinly reported. I gave this talk a couple of years ago, the predecessor of this talk, at the USDA Outlook Forum. I did cattle, Steve Meyer did hogs. After the meeting, a guy from the dairy industry came up and he said, "You're telling me cattle industry has 20%, you're telling me hog industry has 5%, I don't see where the problem is." You know how they trade dairy products? They might have one a week. Okay, now you can value cattle. All you need is one of them. Run one in the room, discover a price, and that's what we'll trade at for the rest of the year. You like that? I'm not sure I like that. I'm not sure that gives you the depth of price discovery. But theoretically, you can do it with one animal. They do it with one load of cheese. Okay, so I'm not stretching the imagination here. This is done other places. Okay, so the other side of that question is, what are you willing to pay for, or what is your market information worth? Think of all the prices we make use of and we don't necessarily contribute to. Okay, what is having reported cash market price worth? What's the cash market volume worth? What are the grid premiums and discounts worth? What are you willing to pay to get them? Or what would you be willing to be paid to provide them? If the answers to these questions are nothing or something real close, I know where your cash market's going. You have huge savings on one side and costs on the other. If the value of the information isn't worth having it provided, then I know where your cash market's headed. Okay, it's very simple economics. It's not market power, it's not coercion, it's not sweet deals. There's a whole lot of things it's not. It's cost savings. Okay. Now we're about to start the part of the talk where I'm not proud of this, but whenever you hear a university professor talk, there should be a couple, 3 slides that don't make any sense. And again, I'm not proud of that. The reason is, if the whole talk that a college professor makes sense, then he's talking about his opinion or her opinion. And what I can assure you is college professors have opinions. And I'm not sure what all those opinions are worth. Okay, so there ought to be a slice of a talk that goes back to some sort of scientific endeavor, and that's what's going on here. Okay, so how thin is too thin? We've been studying this for a number of years, my profession, and there's a couple of things that we have to hook on to. We need this idea of how often something happens, your confidence, and then a pricing error. Think of this as similar to a drug study, an efficacy study of a new pharmaceutical. You need to know how effective it is, and you need to know how accurate you measure that effectiveness. Okay, so it's the same basic idea in thin markets. It's just probably not something you think about. I think about this a lot, but this is what I'm paid to work on, and I don't expect other folks to spend time thinking about this. This is what I do. All right, so there's a bit of a trade-off here, but what we need to know is we need to know a couple of ideas. We need to know probability. So that's the bold, the third line down there. I've got to pick a probability, and then I've got to pick a price error, and then I can use this statistical relationship that's related to power of tests and it's something very similar to what's used in efficacy studies. It's how big of a sample, and then how well do you know something when you study it. Okay, so I've got to pick a probability and a price error, and then I can measure some other stuff. And once I do that, I can work backwards and figure out how big of a cash market you need. Okay? Now, one of the things I've done in the interviews is asked the industry, what's that error and what's that probability, so that I don't have to pick them. But in the past, my discipline has had to assume those numbers. We've had to make a stab at it, and what I'm trying to do is back it up with some interviews. Okay, so there's 3 variables. If I know 2, I can calculate the third one. Okay, and I can calculate how thin is too thin. Okay, so that's where we're going. All right. Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, cash prices in volume. Cash prices in green, volume in blue, and that's cash volume. Cash volume. Okay, your cash volume has fallen off. Is it too thin? Well, depending, if I pick a dollar pricing error and I pick 95% confidence interval, a probability of 95%, I get the red line. That's the number of transactions that's needed, and the number of transactions that I actually have is the black line. Texas has become very, very close to too thin. Let's just flat out call it too thin. There's not effective price discovery done in Texas. Again, imagine how well this went over. All right. Now, the other thing I can do is I can take the number of transactions and then different percentages, and I can figure out what kind of pricing error do we have. With too thin, we've got better than $1. We've got somewhere between 50 cents and $1 a hundredweight pricing error. So the price that we find, that we discover, is different from what we would discover if we had more trades. Okay, so Texas is too thin. I can guarantee you Colorado's too thin. We haven't had much of a cash market for a long time. We've got a couple of big companies up there, and that's largely what we do. Major cattle feeding state, not much cash market transactions. Okay? So when I look at the black line and the red line, they're pretty close together. What we have and what we need are, we've got a thin market in Colorado. And it's been that way for a long time, and this became much more of an issue when what has been happening in Colorado for a long time moved to Texas. Because, after all, it's a whole other country. Okay? Did I offend any Texans? Damn. I just try to do it carefully. All right. Kansas. Let's get to the bottom line. Not too thin, but moving there. Okay? And then Nebraska, that is our thickest market that we have in our cash complex. Nebraska is the center of cash trade with respect to numbers of transactions, the thickness of the market, and it's doing the price discovery work. That's the market we need to protect for sure. And then let's look at Iowa, southern Minnesota. Relatively thick market, but you don't do a lot of price discovery because you don't have enough volume. You don't have enough transactions here. No offense, it's nothing personal, it's just the size of the market. There's a lot more cattle trade in Nebraska. Okay? So, how thin is too thin? I think we can get down in the 5 to 10 to even 15% range and be fine, but if we get below 5, there's the potential to have some pricing errors. That's too thin. It's too thin to do you good. Some regions we're currently at 30 to 40%, in particular that Nebraska region. That's a strong price. That's a strong market. Okay, Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico is there now. Kansas will be there next. Colorado's been there for a while. The center of price discovery will be Nebraska. And because you have the number of transactions, the potential is for it to be here in Iowa as well. But when you look at the data, Iowa follows a lot of other places. Okay, now what do we do about it? Every other industry has gone through this same thing. It's an inevitable part of industry growth and change. Do nothing. And if you don't actively do something else, this is what you'll get. This is not really a choice. This is what happens if nothing happens. Okay? Next, quit opposing things like the Johnson Amendment from the prior Farm Bill, a couple of Farm Bills ago, that limit the use of formulas. we have research that says that will be very expensive to cow-calf producers. It will be very expensive. It will chase away a lot of the efficiencies that we've spent the last, since NPR, capturing. Okay, and what that will do is come out of the cattleman's pocket. That will come out of the packer's pocket, the feeder's pocket, and it will especially come out of the cow-calf man's pocket. This is not something we can just do and nobody's impacted. Privatize the public good. Okay, you got to subscribe. You don't like that idea? You don't like that idea of paying for something you're using? Well, come on now. I thought you guys were big on that kind of stuff. You don't want to pay for stuff you use? I like those prices. I want to know what's going on. There's value to having price information that you don't have to pay for. There is. I recognize that, but no, now I'm antagonizing you. All right, I'm sorry. All right, so that is one way you deal with, for example, the fisheries public good problem. You privatize it. You let the people who fish own the fish. That solves the problem. You privatize the pasture so that it is not overgrazed. You have control of the property that you graze on. You pay the cost if you overgraze it. You have privatized that good. Okay, we can do this. Get together, have informal meetings, get the people together and say, this is what the objective information says. Who in the hell is going to trade cash cattle? And it's a small enough industry that we'll know if nobody does. I mean, that will be real clear. Okay, look for new technology. For as perceptive and entrepreneurial as this industry is, you haven't made that transition into using electronic trading means. Electronic trading had a big potential back in the 80s, and it's been adopted by stock markets and futures trading, but we don't trade cash cattle through electronic means. I think we could thicken up that price reporting by having electronic trading. But somebody's going to have to do that and then participate in it, not stand back and watch. So new technology, develop new information to address some of the risks. Some of those people are in formula arrangements because, especially in Texas, you know, if you've got cattle that need to go this week, you want to make sure they go this week. Because if they don't go this week, they may not go next, and they may not go the week after that. And 3 weeks is a disaster. 3 weeks is very expensive. So what I'll do is I'll get into that short-term formula arrangement. Well, if I knew what we had to sell and what the packers had to buy, then I could manage around that. Okay, I'd put cattle in weeks where I knew the packer needed to buy, and I'd be awful careful with those growth promotants that get me lots of gains, but those cattle have very fixed marketing opportunities once they're done. You have to be very careful with those growth promotants. Employ market makers. Okay, I talked to producers today, producers out in the trade show, and that's what I'm talking about. Somebody to gather cattle, develop some expertise, and sell them. Okay, and there's other examples like that nationwide. So develop market makers, make a concerted effort to do that. Allow them to protect the price information that they discover. Have that be part of participating, something along those lines. Okay. Last, make a market for price discovery. Okay, and I have approached some of the feeders in Texas about this, and they weren't perceptive to it in the beginning. But the idea here is that if you're running a formula and you need information, you might be willing to pay a little bit, and a little bit across those 90% of cattle going to the remaining 2 to 3% that are doing the work. Did you hear me? Going from to, that means getting paid to discover price. If you did that, that would solve this problem. Okay, so you're developing a market for the market that's missing. The market that's missing is the market for price information. Okay, so technology, and I'll speed through here. Technology, it's largely what I talked about. It's developing electronic means where it looks to me like everybody knows a lot about the trade that's going on. So if we had sort of an electronic medium to gather that information, we wouldn't need as many trades. But somebody's going to have to go invest and develop it, and then we'll need to make use of it. Okay? This is done a lot of other places. Almost every other industry that I'm aware of trades this way. And I'm not talking about agriculture, I'm talking about parts suppliers to automobile manufacturers, parts suppliers to computer and printer manufacturers, all of those industrial processes that get farmed out, they're coordinated by B2B transactions, business to business, integrated electronic transactions. It doesn't look like y'all want to log on to the Tyson webpage and schedule your cattle. I bet you they have one developed. Why don't you ask? Because I know there's a couple for meat. I know there's a couple of retailers that have electronic systems that packers can log into and schedule delivery of meat and bid and ask. Okay? Information, I'm not talking about stuff that CANFAX does or you get from the Cattle on Feed report. I'm talking about knowing the inventory of cattle going forward and the packer's sales going forward. This is the level of information you really need to chase away this risk. Pardon my insensitivity, but boy, this is looking under somebody's skirts. This is really sensitive information. But this is the type of information you need to chase away that level of risk. My main point is I don't think you're going to do it. I don't think the industry would do it. This is where we make our money, some of our proprietary information. One of the things that we are seeing in the interviews, though, is a lot more basis bidding and asking. So we start bidding and asking that looks like forward contracts, and then that basis bid ask moves into that 2-week window that's the cash market. AMS continues to report that as forward contracts. That needs to be changed. Okay, and that's very hard to change because mandatory price reporting legislates a lot of stuff. It's very heavy on you will do this. You will do it at 3 o'clock. Okay, we need to seriously look at that legislation and say, what can we take out of the law and put in rule writing so AMS can adjust what they do? And by the way, if you want AMS to do something, you need to talk to your legislators and make sure they have budget. Because everybody likes to talk about less government, but we're not talking about less government when we want AMS to do something for us. And their budget gets hit like everybody else's. Okay, so if you want something more from them, you better make sure, you better do the work to get them budget to do it. They need budget to update how they do things. Okay, I was up in Canada a couple of weeks ago. They're doing basically that. Canada had a very thick cash market that has gone here recently in this last year to very heavily forward contracting. So what CANFAX is doing is reporting out, okay, so this is what's happened in these 2 months, and we've done some flat price contracts for delivery in December, for January, for February, for March. So this is what the industry is discovering for a price for forward contracts. This would be difficult for AMS to do because it doesn't fit within their legislative mandates. You need to free them up to report the information you're looking for. Okay? The Canadians can do it, we can do it. Okay? How do market makers work? Every stock market in the world employs people to stand in the door. If you want to trade Apple stock or Google stock or GE or whatever you want to trade, there's somebody on the other side. You send that order in, it will get filled almost immediately. Why? There's somebody on the other side making a market. No organized financial market operates without market makers. The cattle industry operates without market makers. Okay, if we did something about that, you'd have better market information. Okay, and then tradable permits. You simply have to get and I'm pitching this this is my Texas pitch. Let's get the formula yards to compensate the cash yards and see if we can get back to 10% cash trade. How much are the formula yards willing to pay? Are they willing to pay $1 a head? And if you're willing to pay $1 a head on 90% of the market, the 10% might actually get a decent check. Okay, that's what I'm doing for them. And if you hear about my sudden demise in Amarillo, Texas, this will be why. Okay, free markets are not free. I hate cliches, but they're not. Markets require and consume resources. They're expensive. Furthermore, you have to do some things to maintain them and develop them, update them. The discussion prior to this was international trade. Same idea. You have to pay to develop markets. They don't just grow out of the dirt. You have to rain on them and plant seeds. We want the information that comes from markets, but we want the option not to use them. I would like this industry to make market function and survival a decision and not an artifact, not something that happens because you choose not to act. Okay? And we need some group action to do that, and that doesn't mean the government. That could certainly be through associations. And in the end, we need to remember that public good side. This is not something that we're trained well in economics, in business economics. It is something we're trained in when you broaden your base of economics outside of the operation of your business. Remember the public good aspect, that it's going to take something extra to make it happen.